Welcome to What Even Is Cancer? This is just the learning objectives from like the academy, like, what's the word? Like prospectus, I guess. So what we're going to go through today and what you'll get from the session is that you'll be able to understand the basics of how cancer works and the broad cancer types. And I'll try and do it in like a simple and understandable way. We'll talk about the past, present and future of cancer treatments, what they are and like what their pros and cons are as well. You'll get a bit of an insight into what the patients are actually going through and how we can talk to patients better and how to think about this like in your work and like how to think about it for your clients as well. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about what like the next big things are in cancer and why we need to be mindful of them in future and what we're trying to do as an agency as well. Very brief agenda, we'll talk about what is cancer, what's its impact, how do we treat it, and how do we talk about it. What is cancer? Like the term that we use to talk about the study of cancer whole is oncology, which I'll assume you'll have heard of like lots, like it's quite a broadly used term, and that literally covers the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of all cancers. And cancer at its most basic level refers to what happens when abnormal cells in our own bodies like divide in an uncontrolled way, and that's like the simplest like iteration of how we can describe any type of cancer. But cancer isn't one disease, it's actually like a huge spectrum, like covering like a myriad of different cell types and organs, covering about 100 types of diseases that actually affect humans, which is why it's sometimes a bit difficult. Like I've done it in this presentation calling it cancer, but actually cancer is far more complicated than just one type of disease. Like in a medical setting, you don't have cancer, you have a very specific type of disease. That's kind of what a key thing they want to get across today. So, thinking about how cancer works, like apologies if some of you have seen this before, but this is the current like best analogy that's on the interwebs at the moment, is that cancer acts like weeds in a garden. So if you think about, if you have a garden, if you don't, I apologise. If you think of like our healthy cells as like plants that you want to grow in the garden, normal healthy plants, and cancer occurs when a weed like an abnormally growing cell disrupts the growth of our healthy cells, and it like harnesses like the resources and the nutrients and the energy of a garden being your body, and then spreads like a dandelion, like it spreads and affects other parts of the garden. Sorry, it's getting a bit hippie, like one with the flowers and stuff. So healthy garden, a weed starts growing that affects the growth of the healthy cells, and then it proliferates to spread across the garden, meaning that eventually the weeds or cancerous cells will take over and they use the natural processes that your body already has and sort of hijacks them for its own end. The way that we classify cancer, as I said, it's a broad spectrum of like more than 100 diseases, but we actually classify cancer by the type of cell that it occurs in. And there are 5 main types, so carcinomas, sarcomas, leukemias, lymphomas and myelomas, so blood-based cancers, and then brain and spinal cord cancers. But generally, historically, the way we talk about cancers is that we classify them according to where in the body they happen. So you'll be familiar with like breast cancer, stomach cancer, liver cancer. Obviously, these types of cells that we talk about and like the types of cancer, like their proper terminology is quite medically focused. And I think talking about cancer, where it happens in the body, is a lot easier for us to understand in our day-to-day language. But this is kind of changing, which I'll talk about in a bit. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with this. We also classify cancer by disease stage. So it talks a lot about in the media about like stage 4 cancer or stage 1 cancer, and that means how far into a disease a cancer has progressed, because all cancers are generally progressive disease. If you go back to the analogy of the garden again, early, so stage 1, this means that it's usually non-detectable. It depends by cancer type, but it won't be presenting with any like physical symptoms or anything like that. Then stage 2 is localized, meaning that there probably will be some sort of tumor growth. You might start to see some symptoms, but again, it will be very low level, and it's often quite hard for us to detect cancer at stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 3 is what we call advanced cancer, is when it's starting to spread to other organs and to other systems, but the tumour, typically a tumour, has progressed to such a size that we can actually detect it. But another thing to bear in mind with stage 3 and onwards is that it very much varies by cancer type. This is as approximated as I can to represent all cancer, but again, they're like 100 odd distinct diseases with their own morphologies, and each type of cancer has its own type of like grading system as well, but this is a loose approximation. And then the final stage, which is the most serious, is what we call metastasis. And what this means is that cancerous cells have spread from their original point of origin and have actually, they metastasize, so they spread into a different organ and start making cancer growths elsewhere. So typically we'll talk about, like to give you an example, you can have cancer that starts in your liver up to stage 3, but it could spread to your lung, and that terminology, we'd say the cancer had metastasized from your liver to your lung. And obviously, like ignoring treatment, the earlier we detect cancer, like generally the better the prognosis is for patients, the better the chance they have of like good outcomes in terms of quality and quantity of life as well. And generally, going from stage 1 to stage 4 is correlated with, so is associated with how ill a person is, basically, like how much the cancer is affecting their system and giving them symptoms that make them feel unwell or affect their ability to live lives that they enjoy as well. So a patient's road through cancer has many stages. You'll see that there's a lot of like very emotive language about the way that people talk about cancer patients, like sort of talking about a patient's battle is quite a classic thing, and like their fight and their struggle, which we'll talk about in a bit. But generalizing, there are a few key stages that nearly every cancer patient will go through, which is quite similar to a lot of patient journeys that we'll talk about for lots of different diseases. But patients generally, it depends on cancer and it depends on how good we are at detecting cancer. Patients will typically present around stage 3 because they're actually starting to show symptoms at this stage, unless our method of detection for a particular cancer is very, very good. Often they'll come to their GP, typically in the UK, when they actually start showing some symptoms and they actually start to feel unwell. But at that point, the cancer's already sort of begun, like, its growth, should we say. And that, like, using like a combination of whatever their symptoms are, that'll lead to a diagnosis, and then they often have a variety of treatment choices. Again, it depends on the cancer, and that, like, what treatment choices they have available will vary wildly across like where they live, like country, but also regional as well. Like people talk about like a postcode lottery a lot with cancer, about it depends like where in a country you live, about what drugs are available to you, what surgeries are available to you. And that treatment choice in itself can often be very difficult because of the education and the conversation around cancer. Is that it's an incredibly difficult, like, myriad of diseases to understand. So often one could argue that patients aren't always as informed as they could be about what their condition is, and like that translates into how advocating a patient is about themselves, and also carers as well. Like, it's quite that this stage becomes very, very complicated depending on where you live and education and conversation. And typically patients will then progress once they've chosen one type of treatment. Sometimes this works, sometimes this doesn't. People often talk about like rounds of chemotherapy and rounds of treatment and rounds of radiation because of the sort of the intrinsic nature of how cancer works. As I said, it can be quite, without wanting to be too emotive, it can be quite an insidious disease, meaning that we can't detect it, it spreads, and we don't always know if we've caught it. All those, our detection methods currently are quite poor, so we often have to try different rounds and cycles of different types of therapy and different like modes of therapy as well, just to try and get to a point where it's either survivorship, which I read something that about 50% of people who get cancer survive more than 10 years for all cancers, which is really good, but obviously 50% don't. And that, like, survivorship can vary wildly, or it means that they get to this stage and they've kept the cancer at bay in terms of progression, but their cancer will still progress to another stage. Like often, depending on the type of cancer, depending on how aggressive the type of cancer is, like how quickly it progresses, often between these stages we can just be buying time, and you're fighting again. You're working against a progressive disease, and there's often not a lot we can do about that anyway. So now we're going to talk about the impact of cancer. And impact, I think, is one of those words that's overused a lot. We'll talk about it from the wider scale down to like an individual scale. So the scale of cancer, as I'm sure you might be aware, is absolutely enormous. In the UK alone, in 2012, which is one of the most recent data sets that we have, there were 14 million new cases of cancer. And that's enough to fill Old Trafford 185 times, like across the UK. By 2032, that'll be up to almost 24 million, and that's the population of Australia. And in 2015, cancer caused 8.8 million deaths, and currently cancer is responsible for 1 in every 6 deaths across the world. It's very morbid, and I do apologise. Statistically, it does have a huge impact on human health and human disease. And this is the most recent fact, is that if you're born after 1960, there's a 50% chance that you will get cancer, which is like mind-blowing. So statistically, half of us in this room will get some sort of cancer. So it's probably why everyone started talking about it a lot recently, because it's a pretty big problem. And for the UK in particular, but also globally, like that means that the cost, like literal like cash money, is enormous in terms of testing, treatment, support, like paying specialist staff. But what I mean by wider society is things like how it affects our workforce, education, generally through general poor health, and how that affects lots of different aspects of our society. If you think of like 50% of people after 1960, that's roughly the working population of the UK. And globally, 2.5 trillion US dollars globally a year. So it's pretty big. It's massive. But like obviously it's easy to be sort of overwhelmed by the facts and figures, and they are important when looking at cancer as how it impacts the human population as a whole. But one of the things that we also need to think about and need to be aware is how cancer affects patients on an individual level as well, how it affects one person's daily life. Cancer affects more than just a patient's body. Like obviously there's lots of individual cancers, and there's lots of individual types of patients as well, and everyone has their own story and their own reality. But there's lots of other things apart from the physicality and the clinical side of things of cancer. Often I think it's a failing of pharma that we don't address as much as we should, and support and pharma companies, our clients, could be the people who are offering this sort of support or guiding patients towards this sort of support far more than we are now, because cancer affects things like obviously the physical symptoms, like cancer makes you feel incredibly unwell depending on what type of cancer you have. The side effects associated with things like chemo, radiation, even surgery are well documented. Some patients would rather have their cancer than have chemotherapy because of how horrific chemotherapy can be and the toll that it takes on your body. Mental health and the mortality aspect as well, like often, like particularly for people who are diagnosed a lot younger, like they have to face decisions about who they are, like how long their lifespan is likely to be, like what they've achieved, what they want to achieve with their life, and that can have a massive toll on your mental health. Having to consider realities and make choices and make informed decisions and educate yourself about something that often people never even thought they'd have to do. So thinking about a garden again, and what treatments you might use on a garden as a whole. Like historically, cancer treatments are broad. I'm not going to talk about surgery because it doesn't really fall under our remit very much. Generally, all the brands that we work on tend to be contraindicated for surgery. So meaning that someone isn't eligible for surgery anyway, and that doesn't really come across in our work very well. But surgery generally is quite a good option for lots of cancer patients, like simply just cut it out, and that gives you a really good chance of survival. But we have historically chemotherapy and radiation, which generally people are quite familiar with. Chemotherapy works like spraying a weed killer on everything across a garden. So it'll kill the cancer generally, but it'll also kill all the healthy plants, so like your healthy cells as well. And that is why people lose their hair with chemotherapy, because chemotherapy works by disrupting the growth of all fast-growing cells. I think, like your hair, your nails, your eyelashes, your eyebrows, etc. Radiation is like blasting your garden with sunshine to kill it. So you use the power of light and the fact that radiation can be quite damaging. Again, it targets the cancer cells. Not targets it, it treats the cancer cells, but it also damages some of your healthy cells as well. And for a long time, these two plus surgery were generally the only options that people ever had. Interestingly, which I think is quite morbid, the first chemotherapy was actually derived from mustard gas from World War II, and they realised that it was treating certain soldiers' conditions, I think, and they realised they actually had better outcomes when they'd been gassed, which is quite morbid. Modern cancer treatments, so these are things that we're starting to talk about now, they're more specialised. We're better able now to directly target the cells that are actually doing damage, so the cancer cells. So targeted therapy, that is still like using a weed killer, but it's spraying it directly onto a weed, so like directly targeting a tumour, say, than treating the whole body. And immuno-oncology, which has been talked a lot about at the launch of the academy, like it's a big topic across pharma and the pharma industry in general. And the way that works is like rather than if you go back to the garden, rather than targeting the plants, you add something into the soil that stops the weeds growing to begin with. So the way that immuno-oncology works, and I'll answer some questions about this if you have some, is that it harnesses your immune system and the processes that your immune system has, and uses those mechanisms to stop cancer and to fight cancer. So thinking about the future, sort of the really far in the future, in the next 20 years or so, stuff that we're like what happened with immunotherapy, like 20, 30 years ago, they had the idea for using the immune system. These are the ideas that are floating around now, so we might see those come to market after another 20 years of research, but these are sort of the next horizons of cancer treatment. So using nanoparticles, so creating teeny tiny robots that are released into your blood system to target the receptors on your cancer cells in the same way that drugs do now. Using oncolytic viruses, again, like as so many like useful things do, this was an idea that came out of Soviet Russia, I think, and they wanted to use viruses as a biological weapon. But now someone's like cottoned onto the idea that you can actually use viruses work by using the same processes that cancer do, things like how to replicate cells using our DNA. Viruses actually work that way as well, where they get into the center of our cells and use the cell's sort of operating system to reproduce viruses. So now someone's rather than using that as a weapon, someone's using that idea to design viruses that actually will target cancer cells and destroy them from within. And this is a huge topic at the moment. So this is actually editing the DNA of cancer cells and editing there's an argument for editing the DNA of our healthy cells, because a lot of cancers are associated with gene mutations. So we'll have a particular gene and a mutation in that gene that means that we're more likely to get a certain type of cancer. So the way this technology works is that we'd use proteins to actually go into our cells and edit our genetics so we're less likely to get that cancer. Question that I was anticipating was, will we ever be cancer free? And it's a question that I think is a valid question because it obviously, like from what I've told you today, like it's cancer as a group of diseases affects the human health in such a massive way, in a way that we never even had to encounter before, like in human history. Like again, those of us born after 1960, that 50% of us are likely to get cancer. Like it's huge. So the short answer is probably not, not really. But it's not something to necessarily be scared about. It just means that we have to start thinking about it in a different way. And that kind of gets onto, rather than thinking about treating cancer, we have to think about how do we actually detect and prevent cancer. And as I said earlier, a lot of cancers we don't actually see until stage 3 or 4, meaning when things are actually symptomatic and people are actually showing signs of being ill. But we also know that the earlier you catch or you detect a cancer, the better your prognosis is. Like for a lot of cancers, if you can catch them at stage 1, then you have a 70+% survival rate, which is much, much higher than if you catch it at stage 4, which is generally less than 20%. So detection is the key, and it's probably going to be one of the next frontiers of how cancer works. This is something I found end of last week, that people are talking about how we can use AI to detect cancers. How we talk about omics a lot. So omics generally means looking at the whole profile of something. So we talk about genomics and proteomics and metabolomics, and it's just basically dressing things up as a fancy way of saying we're looking at something as a whole. So genomics just means that we're looking at all of the genetics. Proteomics means that we're looking at all of the proteins in your body. Metabolomics means that we're looking at all the different types of metabolisms in your body. And looking again, rather than looking at things on a small scale, looking at the way the human body works on a holistic scale means that we have a better chance of detecting whether cancer is there earlier or not. So how do we talk about cancer? We've talked about this a little bit so far. We also know that cancer in the media, and the patients can use the media to their own advantage. To your point earlier about NICE approval. So people use the media to explain their stories. You see it a lot, particularly for rare diseases. Again, the NHS have said that I have to die because they won't refund my drug. And sometimes if there's enough of an interest and there's enough of an impetus, it can work. So this is a good example of Cadcycler, which is for breast cancer patients. And a lot of this as well can depend on how emotive a cancer is and how emotive the conversation about a particular type of cancer is. So breast cancer is a really good example of that, of how emotive the language is about breast cancer and identity and femininity, as an example. But the articles actually led to NICE, which we talked about earlier, saying that people could actually, originally it was going to be taken off a list of drugs that we could use, and because of the media campaign, it was actually kept on. So I draw your attention just to show that the difference that it can make when patients are informed and are advocating for themselves and for others. And again, something that we do particularly well is being mindful of the changing digital world that we live in. I saw this last week, Victoria, Derbyshire, on the news. She's been undergoing cancer treatment but still working on the news. And there was a TV show about it recently. And because TV and social media and the internet is where people get their information from, it's actually changing the way that people interact with cancer and in health in general. So this is Stupid Cancer, which we're hopefully going to be able to do some work with, as a company. It's aimed at teenage cancer patients, covering a variety of different cancers. And they found that particularly for teenage cancer patients, they just weren't being spoken to into a way that like they could understand or that they related to. And I think that relates to the point that like the young patient and how do we talk to them, because it isn't just like 40 plus adults that get cancer as well. So they provide a lot of resources for teenagers with cancer. And again, it's very social media focused, very digitally focused, and it is something that we need to be aware of. And I want to draw your attention to this as well, because of stretched healthcare resources, the way that we actually interact with health on the whole is changing as well. So this is Ada, which is an app which I've actually got, and it's really good. I'd recommend you download it. And it's a chat bot that you answer questions on based on how you're feeling. So rather than going straight to your GP, again, they don't sell this, I just think it's good. You can, like, rather than go first point of contact being face to face, you can interact with something that shows you based on the grouping of your symptoms, what you are likely to have. You know, the classic, like Googling, like, I've got a headache, does that mean I have a brain tumor? Instead, it asks you like a series of questions to like create an AI differential diagnosis. So you've probably just got a cold rather than a brain tumor. So it isn't cancer specific, but I do want to highlight it because it just shows that the way that we're interacting with health is increasingly changing, and it's increasingly mobile and digitally focused as well. And this, I think we'll increasingly see this because of how stretched healthcare systems are. Like we see it a lot in the news, like population growth, like aging populations as well. Like the resources are not keeping up with demand, and I think this is where digital health will come in and support that. The sheer scale of cancer, the sort of the deficit in communication, the opportunities that there are for our clients to sort of create change in the cancer sort of pharma landscape means that we as a company can position ourselves as the people to advise on that, and that is kind of the crux of what we're doing with Switched Oncology and the Switched Oncology faculty. So bringing all these things together, like the advances in science, in tech in particular, and data, and how do we like figure out what the next steps are with those, like having an opinion on it, because like it could come to a stage where our clients don't have an opinion on it and need us to guide them, and thinking about our approach to how we talk to the various different audiences that we have, so HCPs, patients, carers, researchers as well, and increasingly payers, like so people who are involved in market access and actually responsible for the cost of drugs and the pricing of drugs is something we're increasingly seeing with cancer, to obviously improve outcomes, but also drive commercial success. Thanks very much.
Thank you.